Hey everyone, it's Innes McVeigh of Inside the Ropes here, joined by a very interesting guest. He's a man who describes himself as creating the worst games enjoyed by millions of people. He's the developer of Wrestling Revolution 2D, Hard Time, and most recently Wrestling Empire. It's Matt, aka MDickie. How's it going, man?
Good, thank you. I mean, I've always been watching Inside the Ropes interviews, so it's a pleasure to step between the ropes with you. And thank you for making wrestling games part of the conversation. It's very exciting.
Thanks very much for joining me, man. I appreciate it. Before we get into like you as a developer and whatnot, I want to start by taking a step back and just talking about you as just a wrestling fan in general. So how did you first become like a wrestling fan? Was there a specific early memory of like when you first saw wrestling and went, oh, this is a thing that I really like?
I can remember the exact day in the playground of school when I was 10 years old in 1990, and somebody pulled out a wrestling card of the Ultimate Warrior. And I just saw this larger, I just thought, what is this? Who is this guy? Why is he dressed like that? This larger than life superhero, except it's a real person. And then him and Hulk Hogan, that got me into checking it out, what it was all about. And then from there, I kind of developed into an appreciation for people like Bret Hart and then I fell out of love with it in the middle of the 1990s, pretty much like everybody else. And then I came back in the Attitude Era in 1998 as an adult, and then I appreciated it for the political reasons. I was really fascinated by what goes on behind the scenes and things like that, and that never went away.
Is that where your sort of inspiration for like the booking and the simulation sort of side of like your development comes from then?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even when I was a kid, I didn't realize it, but I would book my own shows with the Hasbro WWF figures. I didn't realize what I was doing at the time, but if you look back on it 30 years later, it's actually a pretty good preview of what I ended up doing for a living. Now I'm playing with virtual toys, but it's the same spirit. And yeah, that always subconsciously fascinated me as a child. And then as an adult, I thought, okay, what's going on here? That actually interests me more than the actual in-ring product. Is how did they come to those decisions in the first place?
So when you were a fan growing up in that, did you play a lot of the wrestling games when you were younger?
Yeah, I played all of them religiously as and when they came out from 1990 onwards. So starting with WWF WrestleMania for the Super Nintendo, then the Royal Rumble, then I discovered Fire Pro, which had a little bit more depth than that. I discovered Japanese wrestling through that. And then we're talking about the N64 era, and then I discovered Virtual Pro Wrestling and even WWF Warzone. I quite enjoyed that one, and WWF Attitude. I got really excited about that one. And then by the time I was making my own games, it kind of became background noise because I was so busy with my own projects. You can't possibly indulge it that much, and it just quietly disappeared into the background.
Totally.
But it was a good education, though. I consider it a good education, and then that set me up to just off I go on my own after.
There's clearly a lot of inspiration from those sort of games in your kind of development. How did that like passion for wrestling and passion for games then evolve into you wanting to develop games yourself then?
Well, so I was always making my own card games and dice games with those wrestling toys. And the minute I got my hands on a PC around 1998, that just became a natural extension, a natural outlet for the same creativity. All the mathematics stayed the same, but it was now through programming. And yeah, I just started getting creative in whatever I could get my hands on, even if it meant taking a PowerPoint presentation and pulling it out of context so that when you click on things, like other things happen, like a point and click adventure, or even just text games, if that was the first thing I could make in a programming language, or even 2D games. And then 2D games evolved into 3D games, and then 3D games evolved into better 3D games. And so, it's just never taking no for an answer and always doing the best I can with what little I had access to.
So when I was looking through like your early development history for like the stuff DOS you're making, stuff like Hardy Boys Stunt Challenge, the Rock promo cutter, but something you continually mention when you're listing the history of this is that you wanted to, like, there's always a mention of, I couldn't make a legitimate wrestling simulator, and it comes up a couple of times. Was that always your goal early on, to make that full-on wrestling simulator?
It was a distant goal, and as I said, it's just a coping mechanism. If I can't make a full wrestling game, I'll go as close as I can, and I'll make a game all about the stunts, and then I'll make a game all about the promos, and I'll make a game about one match. And then that evolved gradually into a full wrestling simulator. So nowadays, when people come to me and they say, I'm going to make a full wrestling simulator straight away, I'm taken aback because I know how difficult that is. And I know it took me about 12 evolutionary steps to get that far. And I do worry about people that are trying to hit a home run first time.
What's the sort of challenges involved in, like you mentioned, like the how difficult wrestling simulators are to make? What's the sort of challenges behind the scenes involved in that?
Oh, there's lots of different strands that all go further than any normal game would go. I mean, the character customization, hundreds upon hundreds of characters, and the audience expects to customize them to an astonishing extent. If you compare WWE's games to Tekken or something, the character customization is not something that Namco are even worried about, whereas WWE has to get it perfect. And then from the characters, you move on to the animations. We've got hundreds of synchronized move animations. And again, a normal game isn't worried about any of this. And then from there, you're worried about the AI of a match involving dozens of wrestlers and dozens of rules, trying to make sense of it. And again, a normal game doesn't have to worry about any of that. And from my own experience, I can tell you, when I make a game like Hard Time, the prison game, it's 4 times easier than making a wrestling game. And that is no exaggeration.
You mentioned Hard Time there. I think that's actually the first game I heard of yours about. And games like that and games like, the New Testament and stuff like that, I always heard in just general gaming circles that they were not the best games. When did that sort of reputation for you start coming about? Was that hard to overcome early on?
Oh, it was day one. The first published game I ever made in 2002 was always going to have those novice flaws. And what I do is easy to criticize. It looks easy. It walks that line where it's difficult enough that you can kind of respect it, but it also looks primitive enough that you think, oh, I could do that. I could do that. It's exaggerating. It's not that difficult. And I walk that line where it looks like you could do it, but it really is a lot more difficult than it looks. And so I'm easy to criticize. I'm an easy target. It just feels natural for people to criticize me. And I've just never gotten out of that groove. And to this day, people, there's no polite way of saying that this is not as easy as it looks. And a lot of people are going to find that out the hard way.
Is that something you just learned to embrace then, or is it always something in the back of your head?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me from my perspective. I know for a fact when I go to sleep at night how hard I've worked that day. And I know everybody else is guessing, and they're guessing wrong. And so I have the confidence of knowing for a fact that what I did had value. And so I lean into it, I own it, I embrace it, and kind of take away its sting. But I'm also mocking people who genuinely believe that, because I know for a fact they couldn't shadow me for a single morning.
Is there, like, you were an indie developer before, like, really the big indie game boom of like 2011, 2012, stuff like Minecraft and stuff like that. How's the sort of indie game development changed from 2000s into the 2000s in the noughties when stuff sort of boomed?
The biggest change has been the internet and being able to distribute software digitally instantly, because I used to have to distribute CD-ROMs, and you'd have to send it to California and wait a couple of weeks for it to be printed off. And now that's all a thing of the past. And the result is that things have become a lot more open. And that was a big key to my mobile success. Is Google Play became this very open store, and it became very meritocratic. I didn't need anyone's permission to do anything. It was all about the audience reaction, all about the user reviews. Because for 12 years prior to that, I was at the mercy of journalists and the games industry itself and publishers. I had to have everyone's approval to take each individual step. And then that all disappeared overnight. And I haven't looked back since, really.
So you mentioned there about moving to mobile and like the freedoms of mobile. I saw you took a break in like 2010 from like PC game development and then moved to mobile games. What other reasons were there behind the sort of move to mobile other than obviously the freedoms?
Well, I'll tell you what, it's one thing I've missed during the pandemic is walking around and seeing people play my games, because I've released a game on a handheld console, the Nintendo Switch, and I've yet to see anybody playing it because of lockdowns and various restrictions. And I've really missed that, because at the height of the mobile era, I would get on a tube and sit next to someone playing the wrestling game, and there'd be a girl here playing the school game. And that was a good litmus test for genuine cultural impact that you can't buy, you can't fake. And so when I was being told every day that I'm talentless, I'm deluded, that I make the worst games ever, all I had to do was step outside the house. And the opposite evidence was there. The ultimate antidote was there. And so I missed that before the mobile era, and I've missed it during lockdown. But I'm looking forward to getting back into the airports, because I promise this time next year I will have walked through an airport and I will have walked past two brothers playing a tag team match on the Nintendo Switch. And then I'll sit down at a bar next to someone booking a main event on his iPad. And that will be a good seal of approval for me. If I can't have critical acclaim or the acceptance of the industry, I can have a genuine relationship with my players.
What's the sort of challenges of developing for mobile versus PC and porting those games over from PC to mobile?
Well, there was a lot of limitations at first. I mean, Wrestling Revolution 3D had a shocking 50 frames per second frame rate, which is almost unplayable. It was unplayable at the time, to be honest. And but it was a sacrifice that had to be made to get any characters in the ring, let alone a dozen. And so you're constantly making sacrifices like that, compromises like that get a game over the finish line. And even on the Nintendo Switch, I've had to compromise a lot to deliver a game that can load up to 30 wrestlers in the ring instantly. And it's a big accomplishment. And that circles back to the criticism. I know for a fact what I had to do to get this project over the finish line. And I know my critics are mistaken when they say otherwise. And yeah, that's the best way I can sum it up.
When you were developing Wrestling Empire and you decided to take your first sort of foray into console game development, why was the Switch your choice over Xbox or PS4 or something like that?
Well, I had completely retired by the end of 2018, and I didn't intend to come back at all. And then I spent the whole of 2019 playing games for the first time for entertainment, and I just found myself playing Super Mario Odyssey on an aeroplane to pass the time. And it did rekindle my love for just games for their own sake. And then the opportunity to develop for that particular console, and then the opportunity to bring back a low-tech wrestling game at the exact moment people were clamoring for one. That was just too much of a setup to miss out on. And I did apply to all of them at the same time, but Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation. I've been accepted into all programs, but I favored the Nintendo Switch because a handheld, a touchscreen handheld that needed a low-tech retro game, that was a perfect fit for me. Whereas all that's waiting for me on a next-gen console is a lot of criticism about graphics and frame rates, which I'd rather not have that conversation. And so yeah, I'd rather. So now I'm happy to lean into this idea that I'm a handheld developer, a mobile developer, because even on Steam, we're going to see the Steam Deck by this time next year. And I'll have carved a nice little niche out for myself as this guy that makes low-tech games, that gaming that goes with you is something I'm happy to focus on.
I suppose as well on the Switch, there's not really a huge competition in the wrestling space because there's 2K18, which the port of that was
yeah, a bit shaky. That's what I was talking about. It's so difficult to squeeze 3D wrestling onto Nintendo Switch because it does have its limitations. And WWE kind of struggled a couple of times. And so I had to, and I don't think any of the other studios want to go anywhere near it. And so, yeah, I was very excited about coming in there and providing an alternative, a low-tech alternative.
You mentioned WWE there, and there's the various other developers of wrestling games now. Was there ever a moment over the last 20 years where you were contacted by a big wrestling developer about your work, about maybe, joining a team or something about that?
No, that's never come up. I've talked to friends of friends who have spoken to these companies, but to be honest, they don't want me because I'm a liability who's going to give them a lot of explaining to do with the graphics and everything. If I show up for an AEW game or a WWE game, they'd have a lot of explaining to do about why it looks like this, why it works like that, and so they don't want me, and I also don't want to lose my freedom to them. So we've both got things that we value, and there's no real overlap between the two.
over the last 20 years, we've like seen a big shift in like wrestling game development as a whole. And obviously now we've got stuff like the wrestling code, obviously the AW game, WWE. How much has the landscape in your mind sort of changed over the last 20 years?
Over the last 20 years, it's definitely become more accessible, because when I was coming up, it was inconceivable that you would make a wrestling game in a small team, let alone on your own. And now there's a handful of projects by solo developers, let alone on small teams. And so I take pride in being a small part of making that palatable, acceptable, conceivable, because people have reached out to me themselves and said I was part of that journey. And so, yeah, I'm proud to have been a small part of that, and I'm excited to see where they take it, to be honest.
When I was looking on your Facebook just before we started this, and I saw last month you posted that Wrestling Revolution 3D is the most downloaded sports combat game on mobile. Does that sort of feed into the idea you mentioned earlier about validation about against these people who are critical of your sort of development?
Yeah, that was a huge milestone for me. 100 million downloads on Google Play alone, which quite frankly is more wrestling fans than there are in the world, because it's probably multiple accounts or something like that. But yeah, the story behind that is that I've got a huge audience in countries all over the world, so that's a huge international following. Whereas when you focus on North America and the UK, you can't even conceive of those numbers. But part of that is that when I deliberately made games that are low tech, you have to understand that the average person is walking around with a mediocre Android phone. And for them, my games were the best ones they could get to work. And so this Western elitism we have, where we think we're talking about frame rates and talking about next-gen consoles, for millions of people, that is not an accessible reality. And my mobile success came from just making games accessible for everybody.
Was YouTube a big part of your success? Because I hear a lot of like back in the day about a lot of like YouTubers and content creators like helping boost the sales of indie games. Was that something you found?
It's certainly recently a lot of streamers have been playing the games, and that's usually it's good exposure. Although the content is usually negative, the result is usually positive, because once you start talking about a game, that's it. It's free publicity. And but yeah, and definitely YouTube has become. It's interesting because YouTube used to be the bane of my existence, and it used to be this big red arrow. In my mind, it was this red danger, this painful arrow that was always stabbing me with criticism. And then I slowly kind of embraced it and turned it around and turned it into one of the biggest weapons in my arsenal, where I could build up a following of 100,000 subscribers and turn that into a silver bullet that works for my company. And now it's one of the most valuable tools in my arsenal, is having 100,000 subscribers that I can rely on to set the right tone and to get excited about projects and about developments without relying on everybody else.
As a like fan and developer right now in the industry, where do you want to see wrestling games in general go this year and beyond?
Where I want them to go is I want them to become less graphics heavy, because that's the reason we're not seeing them on the Nintendo Switch. And because if you think about it, the Nintendo Switch is the most popular console in the world right now, with it's a spiritual successor to the N64, which everyone says was the golden age of wrestling games. And yet none of the major studios are developing for it. And that's a big red flag, in my opinion. And the only reason you would come to that conclusion is because you are prioritizing graphics over gameplay. There is no other logical reason why you would avoid that platform, not jump onto that platform. And so, yeah, I think the biggest thing, and that's also the reason these games are taking so long to make, which is why they're becoming so expensive, is this graphics heavy focus. And the minute we step back from that and embrace more of a low tech style, I think games will become more lightweight, and they'll be all the better for it. The content will come back into focus.
to cap us off, like you've obviously got Wrestling Empire, and there's various updates and that coming out for it. What's your sort of future goals in games development, both in wrestling and just in general?
I think the biggest goal for this game was the ultimate aim for this game is to see free roam. So for the first time in 3D, we'll see some free roaming adventures, because we've seen it in 2D and that was very successful. And now all I have to do is transplant that to 3D, and it'll hopefully be an even more engrossing experience. And to the possibility to also sidestep and bring that into wrestling for the first time in my games is also an exciting opportunity that I'm looking forward to exploring. Although thus far the game hasn't quite been successful enough for that to make financial sense. There's not enough financial support for me to work on it beyond this year. But ideally, that would have been a good goal.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and comment, as it really helps out the channel. Make sure to check out my other interviews with Progress Tag Team Champions Lycos Jim and former WWE star Weston Blake. Make sure to subscribe for more content soon.